All right, my friends, welcome to our penultimate lecture in the course, and also perhaps our penultimate/ultimate lecture on Thomas Mann. We will talk a little bit about him and the Magic Mountain and the last couple chapters of it as it wraps up on Monday, as we also continue to wrap up and introduce Virginia Woolf. Do keep in mind that if you're writing on Virginia Woolf, as several of you are, make sure to listen to the Virginia Woolf lectures from classes prior so that you have some context. There are some details in that text that are sometimes very useful to include in your essays, and these details can be found in my lectures on Virginia Woolf. Each from 2024 to 2023, there's one or two lectures on each. Very similar to what we will have, but will not have had during the majority of your writing. I also welcome you to celebrate today. Today is a wonderful day. 4/23, April 23rd, is both the birthday of William Shakespeare, from our own linguistic heritage, English, as well as Miguel de Cervantes. As you recall from our lectures earlier in the semester, they were probably born on different days, but the Brits and the Spanish used different calendars at that time, and so they were born on the same date. Also, as my wife was born on this date, and so it makes very good sense that she would marry a literary person. That said, we got a bit into the Magic Mountain last time, not only talking in summary form, but about quite a bit that is in there, including philosophy and notions of death, and time, and illness. Today, we are going to bear out some of the claims and the comments made in last class. And in particular, I want to share with you some very useful and very interesting quotes on death and illness and sickness. So let's get into talking about chapter 2, a history of tragedy. Recall in chapter 1, we had Hans Castorp make it to the Berghof he met at Davos Platz by his cousin Joachim Siemsen. Joachim, who wants to be a military man, whereas Hans Castorp wishes to be an engineer, brings the book Ocean Steamships, and will soon, 3 weeks later, return back to an unpaid position at an engineering firm. So we thought. Chapter 2 then takes us in a different direction. It moves away from linearity in the narrative in a way that we would expect after having read Ulysses. But it gives a little bit of context on Hans, sort of context that we don't get in Ulysses regarding Stephen or Leopold Bloom, except through sort of momentary, fragmentary memories and thoughts that pass through their minds. That said, one could also read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in order to get background on Stephen in particular. That said, this chapter concerns the early loss of Hans's mother, his father, and then grandfather within 2 years of each other. Something you might want to think about if you are really allegorizing this text, which does seem to lend itself to being read symbolically in a political or philosophical or psychological ways. Is Hans like a contemporary modern human? Missing his father, his mother, and his grandfather. These are family members who represent tradition and that which has come before and offer a guiding hand to those who, their progeny, who come from. Is Hans himself a representative of a modernist human who lives in this secular world that no longer is governed by, say, a Judeo-Christian Islamic God, but is far more of a scientific cosmos, far larger than we ever expected, infinite, in fact, and growing, which is a strange concept. And we should really think about whether infinity means perfect or imperfect in that it is constantly changing by expanding. This is an ancient logical problem, by the way. Is infinity perfect? How can it be perfect if it continues to grow? That which continues to grow admits of change. That which admits of change cannot be perfect. QED, quod erat demonstrandum. That which was to be proved is what QED means. You put it at the end of mathematical proofs. Euclid first made that famous, except for he did it in Greek. Hoper eidai, hoper dexe. I can't remember the third word, but dexi means to prove, and that which was to be proved. Hoper dexi. I'll have to look it up. In any case, so in this chapter 2, we learn about the history of our protagonist, Hans Castorp. We learn about the macabre history that even as a young person, he lost those that would guide him. And perhaps filling out this notion that he himself is like a modernist European individual who no longer has a tradition to guide him forward. who is disoriented and must find his path through this woods. But where is it that one is going when one is stuck in the woods? What does it mean to get out of the woods if one is disoriented intellectually or philosophically? What is the trajectory of one's life? What direction should one go? What should one aspire towards? How should one even direct one's moral compass in such a world? For example, in a world without father, mother, grandfather, would Don Quixote's way of approaching the world with fictional texts as his basis for understanding reality be equally valid to someone who perceived the world in a more realist fashion, like, say, Sancho Panza? Obviously, we know Don Quixote, the text, weighs in on this idea. It's not quite modernist yet. It suggests that Don Quixote is, in fact, the same. But now that we are to true modernism, in the wake of World War I, if we are no longer part of a religious or a coherent philosophical tradition, what is the best way to live? In fact, there's a very famous book that was adapted by Hayao Miyazaki that means that is called How Should We Live? And it really investigates these sorts of questions. And it's a very difficult question, particularly if you study lots of literature, philosophy, religions, and you see, man, all these people from different times and places, they believe all of these different things and organize their lives in very, very different ways. Which way is correct? Is a major question of today and in this post-colonial, imperialist, cosmopolitan milieu. Once you see the selection of the all-you-can-eat buffet of thought, the only problem is you only have so much room in your stomach. You only have so much time in your life to pursue and fulfill these philosophical and religious systems, if you wish to fulfill or pursue any of them, which is, of course, your modernist, postmodernist, post-postmodernist choice, as it were. And so, when we see Hans Castorp sitting in limbo for 7 years, devoting himself first to this and then to that, and not seeming to move forward at all, one wonders if this is a symptom of his philosophical malaise, of the fact that he does not have a religious or philosophical system driving him in a certain direction. We know that the political system behind him was driving him into being an engineer so that he could help produce instruments of war. Myself, having gone to Marquette, I knew many engineers, and they're very proud individuals. In fact, it's funny, me studying philosophy and literature, which are generally considered the higher arts, the humane arts, I felt that they were the lower arts because the pride of place was given to people who could build ships, that sort of place, not people that understand the causality that moves the motions of the heavens. Though I did eventually find my niche, though, well, the higher on the mountain you go, the smaller the niche happens to be. In any case, originally this was to be the first chapter of the book, but Mann switched its position to second in editing. That's something you might really want to consider if you're thinking about formalist aspects in this text. Why is the historical intro in the second chapter rather than in the first? I think you probably have some inkling, right? When you first learned how to write, your high school teacher probably said something along the lines, and if they haven't said it, they did say this to you, bad high school teacher. Sorry, as I fiddle trying to get this perfectly shaped expo marker that just fits my pocket perfectly. They probably said you need to start with a hook. And so generally with literature, or one technique is to start in medias res. One thing about this, I have classical education, so I have a very particular persnickety way of translating this. This does not mean into the middle of things. That would be in media res. That would be a different Latin. This means into central things. Get to the point is what in medias res means. Right into the middle of the main situation that matters. And think about it. You start watching or reading something where a situation is ongoing, has been happening. What is your immediate reaction as a reader? You need to figure out, you're disoriented, you need to figure out what's going on. And this is very motivating. This often makes one continue to turn the pages or watch the show, put the remote down, because what's happening? What's going on? Who are these characters? What is their relationship to each other? What is the nature of this world? In fact, you probably noticed that with, like, say, fantasy and sci-fi genres, the first season or even episode or book is often the best because there's the least amount of clarity about the nature of the world. You have the most questions you have about how powerful are people in this world and what are the gods of this world and this protagonist, what is he, she, or they truly capable of? Usually just about as much as you as a young person, but then perhaps they become something like the hero of light by the end of things, some sort of angelic savior figure. In any case, this chapter probably comes second because you need to be interested in a character first before learning the history of it. If one is on the dating app, one has to first swipe and be interested in an individual before sitting down at a date and learning the personal history of this individual, right? It's only after you're interested in something that you want to really learn about it. And so I think appropriately, this second chapter is put in the second position so that we can learn about the protagonist with whom we spend 7 years, 7 chapters, and 700 pages. In any case, perhaps also Hans's thoughts on death are a bit heavy for a first chapter. A first chapter of, remember, a book that was originally meant to be a comic companion to a tragic work, and yet tragedy seems to find its way into this text. This should perhaps also tell you something about Thomas Mann. Oh yes, and I looked this up for you. I said that suicide was a major part of his life. It was very sad. 2 of his sons committed suicide, including Klaus Mann, who himself wrote a Roman Clef, which means a book with a key on Mephistopheles, and which there was a movie adaptation made of it about when the Nazis came to power and what the role of actors on the stage would be. And very interesting question. What are artists supposed to represent during times of war? For example, you never make movies that are non-nationalist during a wartime. You never make movies that question the value of, say, military troops or the military life or things like that. It's considered an extremely bad taste and often won't even be made. During times of war, often one has to be extremely positive towards the place where one lives, particularly because many of the people around one will have family members fighting and or dying or having died because of this. There's a lot of emotion aroused due to war. We can see that to some extent now. That said, let's move on to Hans's thought on death. Analyzed and put into words. Interesting, this word analysis. It comes through in psychoanalysis. Settembrini has an ambiguous relationship to it. Analysis is good when it helps you reflect. It's bad when it becomes a barrier to motion in your own life. And you probably know that too. The difference between thinking something through, very useful, and overthinking, which is like chewing gum, right? You're doing something but not accomplishing anything. And in fact, I don't know if any of you read the recent research on chewing gum, but if any of you are very afraid of microplastics, I would not chew any gum ever again because they released something like 3,000 different traces of microplastics after 8 minutes of chewing. So 6 or 7 minutes of chewing and then get rid of it. There are also digestive processes that go into action when you chew gum too much. One builds up the sorts of things that are meant to move food through one's digestion because chewing is part of the digestive process. In any case, analyze and put into words, his feelings might have been expressed as follows. There was something religious, written, sadly beautiful, which was to say spiritual about death. We'll have an opposing perspective to this soon. And at the same time, something that was the direct opposite, something very material, physical, which one could not describe as beautiful or gripping, religious, or even as sad. This seems somewhat true, right? We do have rituals surrounding death that help us to venerate the process of it. Particularly if one comes from the Christian, Jewish, or Islamic tradition, there are burial rites, very specific burial rites that help one to see death as a natural part of life, where people sit in silence and words are spoken, the so-called eulogy, the good words, that's what that means. You speak about the good things one did. And flowers are given, the casket is often displayed, sometimes open, which is sort of horrifying, sometimes closed. Oftentimes people like to keep their caskets open awake, but then closed at the actual funeral. It can be very emotionally arousing when people see the face of someone who's died, and if you've ever been to a funeral, it's also sort of horrifying because the person's face looks so different from what they did. Like a man in particular in like a suit or a tuxedo will look more like sort of a ventriloquist. They'll have so much makeup on their face. And so one of those emotionally arousing things that we keep people away from, except for in particular venues where they are allowed to quietly and somewhat privately express their emotions. But there are also extremely ugly parts of dying. The Austrian horsemen, the sounds of dying, the look of dying. You even think of your own perceptions. Do you prefer protagonists in shows and movies that are young or old? What about really old? Would you prefer Don Quixote as a character if he were 25 as opposed to 50? But also, besides the sounds and the looks of death, there's a smell to death as well. And this is perhaps the most powerful thing. I don't know, again, if any of you have ever hunted or had to hunt in your house for something that has died there because you have smelled it, but the smell of putrefaction and death is gross and powerful. In fact, in a work we didn't consider in this course, this is written by one of the authors we did, Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, of character Father Zosima. He's a very holy individual who has a huge influence on one of the main character Alyosha's life. When Alyosha goes to see his holy body, he considers this man almost like a living saint while he's alive. When he goes to see his body in death, regardless of his sacred feeling, his holy feeling, his venerable feelings towards this individual, he is disgusted by the smell of him. And this shocks him because he has this sort of religious view that all things are sort of spiritual. He is smacked in the face by the physicality of life. And so I think this is an important reflection about the duality of existence. Can death be holy and beautiful and have a sad, gripping quality to it? Yes, of course. If you've ever seen Titanic, spoiler alert, how Jack goes down, it's very sad, freezing in the Atlantic Ocean. But are there also physical, non-sacred aspects of dying? What do you do with, I mentioned a motorcycle that exploded in front of me on I-10, not I-10, excuse me, it was either the 163, we call our highways in California, it was either the 163 or the 15. What do you do with all the detritus from that explosion? Well, you have to deal with it. You have to get rid of it. And so there are physical, mundane aspects to illness and death, as well as venerable and holy ones. Is it one or the other? It seems to be like a yin-yang, both. In any case, chapter 3, getting to know the Berghoff. We see Hans dine at Joachim's table and learns about the 7 tables. Remember the 7 symbolism that truly perforates this text. Hans first hears the slamming door caused by Madame Shosha. Something interesting about his attraction to Madame Shosha, besides the obvious homosexual elements, in that he is over and over and over again, particularly in chapters 4 and 5, comparing Madame Shosha to this young Kyrgyz eyes individual named Krigoslav Hippa, who lent him a pencil. A couple other things about Madame Shosha that he notices. She slams doors. She has jagged, unclean fingernails. She slumps in her chair, something a lot of us do, but she also slinks about. And very interesting for the cosmopolitan notions of this place. Remember that the Berghoff has people from many different places: Mexico, Italy, Germany, Russia, and the various stands we hear of, though not by name, maybe Kyrgyzstan. She speaks German occasionally. She is a French and Russian speaker, but can speak a little bit of German. And when Hans hears her speak German, he notices that she doesn't speak German very well, and he experiences a moment of pleasure and pride. Remember, Germany, this powerful place in the European space before World War II, before World War I, and even now, to this day, it is the most powerful place, the most powerful country in Europe economically speaking. He's very. It's almost like he looks down on Metempsychosis as a Russian. He has a certain attraction to her, perhaps like Don Quixote had a certain attraction to a certain peasant girl, though the questionable how much he'd actually seen this Aldonza Lorenza, who he calls Dulcinea. But you see here that this is a sexual attraction, not necessarily based on mutual respect, but on a certain denigration as well. And so the attraction is, to say the very least about it, given the elements I've laid out for you, a bit odd, certainly questionable. How are they even going to communicate with each other? I mean, have you ever thought about the idea of, like, say, and perhaps this is a millennial sort of expression, but the idea of what is it that we used to call, there's an actual term for this, term for like purchasing a wife from a different country. I'm forgetting what the term for that actually is. Do you recall that? But the idea would be that what? You have somebody come to this country. There's some sort of transaction that's come that's been involved with it, and they don't speak the same language. Besides the very nature of a transactional sort of of a relationship starting from a transaction, how are people who don't speak the same language together supposed to grow together? Let me make this more problem. Let me problematize this more. If the most important thing about a relationship is holding shared values and principles and believing similar things, and then acting in a unified way, how are you going to share your most refined notions of religion and philosophy and ethics with somebody with whom you cannot communicate? Your relationship would be stunted to some extent. It would focus on what? Crass materiality, base physicality, and the sorts of things that you are capable of communicating in simple speech. I want this, I like that, I don't want this. Sort of like a childish relationship. In the same way that children are handicapped or disabled by their lack of art, by their inability to articulate themselves. And so they must scream or whine or lash out or cry, rather than saying, I very much dislike that injustice and would like to remedy it. And this is not something that a 3-year-old is capable of doing. That said, Hans first hears the slamming door caused by Metempsychosis, and quite that sound itself and how it shocks his system the first time might itself be a symbol for how her existence in the world shocks his life. Maybe some connection between Germany and Russia there, if one really wants to try and think politically. He meets Herr Settembrini. Remember that Herr is Mr. in German, and that Settembrini's name is Ludovico. Is soon to be failing guide and mentor. Settembrini describes himself as malicious. In fact, multiple times is compared to Satan in the form of the Italian name Satanic. In fact, he is himself he is very proud of a political literary thinker named Carducci, and Carducci himself wrote a work in which Satana was part of the title itself. But one thing you might want to keep in mind, being very allegorical today, apparently I stick to a theme when I lecture, is in the same way that Franz Kafka writes a little story about Don Quixote, where he suggests that Don Quixote is not real, but is a figment of Sancho's imagination. So all that Don Quixote does in Don Quixote is actually done by Sancho, but we are yet one level removed from reality, even beyond Don Quixote, in that the rationale for all that happens is Sancho saying that this character, invisible Don Quixote, may happen. Okay, interesting. I would suggest, and this is a weak suggestion, this is more for your own edification and interest than perhaps something you would necessarily write on, but you could. But Settembrini acts like a Satan figure to Hans Castorp. Satan in the original sense of the Hebrew word Satan, which means adversary or accuser, someone who accuses him of what is true about him in a way that these other characters who are not as close to Hans Castorp, who barely speak to him, who perhaps can't even speak to him in his German and his limited French, perhaps this Settembrini though obviously he is a character that exists, is meant to resemble Mephistopheles to us. He is compared to Satanic, speaks a truth to Faust that no other, or excuse me, to Faust, to Hans Castorp that no other character speak. Even Joachim, even when Joachim can see through what Hans Castorp is doing as he develops his relationship with Madame Shosha, stopping in the halls, trying to talk to her in the waiting room before being checked up on, walking past her as he sees her and saying hello to her. Joachim maintains what we call a stiff upper lip. He is clearly bothered by Hans Castorp's actions, but he doesn't say anything about this. Settembrini, who is described as a windbag by Hans Castorp, says all too much, and really mixes Hans's head up, really spoils his fun. And in fact, they do have a break for some amount of time near the end of the text. So we also see one of these strange things happen in the Berghof that is not a common happening outside, in normal bourgeois life, which is there's this one Herr Albin who during the morning rescue is hanging out with some ladies. He really wants to entertain these ladies. And so he's messing around with his knife. They're tittering about him. Oh my gosh, you need to put that knife away. He's like, this is a good sharp knife. It's the air of dangerousness is arousing people's interest. And then he says, this knife, I might as well just go get my gun. I have a gun here. And the woman's like, oh my, don't get your gun. And he says, the reason I have this gun, and he doesn't have it on him yet, is so that I can take care of myself when I get sick of this. This freaks people out. And in fact, Joachim says, Herr Albin, he should have been going on about that. He probably set those ladies back 3 or 4 weeks, shooting their temperatures through the air. He was supposed to be at rest, not being aroused by danger, like the Herr Albin says. But again, we see the presence of death and the acceptance of death in these characters, how close death is to these characters, young and old as well. Death does not differentiate at the Berghof between old and young. In fact, there are young or gender either. It doesn't matter whether one is man or woman or anything else. Death comes for them. In any case, Settembrini gives a warning. I salute reason. He is, of course, a homo humanus, as he calls himself. Another good bit of Latin there. That means a humane person. Obviously, homo means human in Latin, means same in Greek, so sometimes you get messed up by that. So we are homo sapiens, that's Latin, but one might be a homosexual, that's Greek. Homo means the same in Greek, but it means human in Latin. This is why we are described as hominids. Humanus is where we get the word humanities from, and this is a humanities course. In any case, I salute reason, Settembrini replied, and I salute courage as well, by the way. What you say sounds good, and it would be difficult to find any truly cogent objection. This is where he shares the story that I mentioned to you last time about a young girl, Ottilie, who finds herself at home in the Berghof. But is the Berghof a place that can truly be your home? It seems to be a temporary place, as a hospital, a place that you stay before you die or before you get better, not somewhere that you spend the entirety of your life. Though, perhaps I'll be contradicted by our astute and learned friend. There was a Fräulein Kneifer just last year, Ottilie Kneifer, from a fine family, the daughter of a high governmental official. She had a good life to return to, ostensibly. She was here for about 1.5 years, a long amount of time. And became so splendidly accustomed to life up here that once she had been completely restored to health, and that does happen, people do get well up here sometimes, she refused to leave on any account. She fervently begged the director to be allowed to stay. She simply would not return to home. This was home to her. This was where she was happy. In fact, if I continue the quote just for a little bit, and get into what she does, this was home to her. But there was such a press of people wanting to get in. They needed her room. Her pleas proved in vain, and they insisted that they would have to dismiss her as healed. Ottilie came down with a high fever, let her chart just shoot up with a vengeance, except that they found her out by substituting a silent sister for her usual thermometer. You don't yet know what that is. It's a thermometer without any markings, and the doctor checks it by laying a scale up against it and draws the chart himself. oddly, sir, had a temperature of 98.4. That's not a fever. 98.6 is the normal amount. Oddly had no fever. And so she went for a swim in the lake. It was only the beginning of May. Still was frost at night, but the lake was no longer ice, a degree or two above freezing. In fact, she stayed in the water for a good while trying to catch her death or something, trying to catch pneumonia. And with what success? She remained perfectly healthy, like an ice bath these days. She left us in agony and despair, deaf to her parents' words of comfort. What is there for me down below? She kept crying. This is my home. I don't know what became of her. It seems you're not listening, are you, my good engineer? If I'm not quite mistaken, you're having difficulty even staying on your feet. That is the nature of being a lecturer, is to be speaking with great energy to somebody who is perhaps yawning and cannot maintain focus. That said, Settembrini here is warning Hans Castorp that young individuals that come to the Berghof tend to adapt to it and over-adapt to it. And they seem to think it's a home in which they can live rather than a place that they need to go in order to get healthy. Keep in mind also, though, that like with the stories of Odysseus, which tells of Scylla and Charybdis and Sirens and Circe and Calypso, that we do not ourselves see this happen during the course of the text. We have from Settembrini that this is an example. Whether this is an honest and true example is open to question. I think it's clearly an example meant to guide Hans Castorp and perhaps good advice, but did it really happen? It's something that you might wonder yourself. In any case, chapter 4, the question arises, will Hans stay or will he go? Conspicuously, our hero, so-called, purchases not only new blankets and a necessary purchase, but also a thermometer from Nurse von Millendorf. We learn here also about his early romantic interest in a young man named Shivslav Pippa. Pippa, one day in elementary school, grammar school, who was apparently very smart and was grade above Hans, though they were the same age. Hans had forgotten a pencil for a drawing exercise. And so he had to go ask somebody for it. And so apparently he'd been looking at this young man. And I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but I do feel like this is something that young people do. They've been sort of admiring him from afar, never spoken to him. And when the moment came for him to borrow a pencil from somebody, he realized he didn't know anybody better than Shivaslav. Apparently he didn't have a lot of good friends, but he asked for the pencil from the person that he had been admiring, that he had been thinking about, that he had been gazing at, the person that he felt he did know the best. And to his own consternation or annoyance, Shivaslav does lend him the pencil, but says, be sure not to break it and give it back. Hans thinks, as if I meant to break it. So very funny sort of thing. In any case, we then here in chapter 4 have our excursus on illness. The same way we talked about venerable and non-venerable physical aspects of death, perhaps we have similarly dueling perspectives, dual with an A, but then dueling with an E, on illness. And perhaps one of these perspectives reflects your own. Hans, because for someone who's ill, one wants to express a certain seriousness and deference, doesn't one? Illness has something more or less venerable about it. So he holds the perspective that illness, like death, has a sacred aspect. That if one is ill, in fact, there's an old expression that for somebody who's cognitively disabled, that they were touched by the angels. You see how this makes a person who is not up to standard in one way, is in some way made holy, however. And so even though they might have a lower social value in terms of, say, the skills that they bring to bear, they may be given an additional higher social value by being put in a class of those sort of touched by the divine, touched by God, or touched by an angel, to quote the name of a show from my youth. In any case, Settembrini responds, illness is rather a debasement, a lowering. Indeed, a painful debasement of humanity, injurious to the very concept itself. Illness is injurious to the concept of being human. So what does it mean to be human? If illness, which is a part of all human life, is in itself. And although one may tend and nurse illness in the individual case, to honor it intellectually is an aberration, abomination. A human being who lives as an invalid, invalid is an old way of saying somebody who's perpetually sick and incapable of work. A human being who lives as an invalid is only a body. And that is the most inhuman of debasements. In most cases, he is no better than a cadaver. The suggestion of Settembrini here seems to be that when you are healthy, you have the use of your mind and reason, and you can align your actions with your reason while maintaining or while giving minimal attention to your body. You eat, you sleep, you talk to the people and engage with people you need to in order to be happy enough, but mostly you are capable of doing what it is you choose to do, ostensibly based on rational considerations. But what do you do? What happens to you when you're sick? Are you as capable of living your normal life? Or must you give additional attention to your body? Must you pay more attention to just yourself in order to get through the day? And are you less subject to the body when you are sick and therefore more capable of doing what you wish? Or are you more subject to the body and therefore less capable of doing what you wish? Think about various foods. Do they taste good? Can you keep them down? What about if you have a head cold? Are you coughing every 5 seconds? Are you snotting every 5 seconds? Is this something that helps you to study, or helps you to work out, or helps you to be in an interview for your internship or next job? These are interesting questions, but keep in mind that, again, Hans thinks in sort of a romantic way about what death and illness are, whereas Settembrini thinks illness is not a good thing. People do not want to be ill. They want to be healthy. Very interesting, given what Thomas Mann will write about 20 years later with a character who himself willingly, consciously contracts syphilis in order to be a good writer. He contracts an illness in order to become a great writer, though he certainly knows what the costs of that are. In any case, placet experiri is a little bit of Latin that is shared by Settembrini that he says about Hans Castorp. It means he likes to experience. Experiri looks like a passive infinitive there, but it's really a deponent verb. And so it just has a passive form, though an active meaning. Though to experience itself is an interesting verb. Is it active or is it passive? Sort of a funny question. In any case, he likes to experience, said by Settembrini of Hans Castorp. Is placet experiri the philosophy of Hans Castorp? If there is no coherent, single, unitary way to live. The Buddhists didn't get it right, the Taoists, the Jewish individuals, the Christians, the Muslims. Well, what if one doesn't follow a single way of living, but just tries to experience the maximum amount in life? That might be a principle that one could actually follow, but keep in mind the dangers of such a principle. If one doesn't develop a trajectory in life, a career, maybe a family, things that change one as one takes steps up their various ladders, so that one is in a different place over time near the end from in the beginning. Where does one get to if one indulges in experience over and over? Does one ever get very deep into anything one does? For example, my own profession takes something like 20 to 25 years of schooling in order to get to the professional level. But if one just studies literature for 6 months or a year and then moves on to a different discipline, has one really learned everything that literature has to offer? Does one who indulges for a short amount of time in anything, biology, religion, astrology, music, how much do they learn while taking little bits of lots of different sciences and arts compared to one who studies one in great detail? Is there a difference of breadth and depth? Or is one experience substantial, seems to be Settembrini's idea, and the other superficial? fact, sometimes we have words for these. We have a French word, as well as a different word that's dropping out of my head for such sort of individuals who sort of casually approach the things that they do. We call them charlatans. Someone who wishes to be an expert on something, but is inexpert. Somebody who just touches on arts rather than truly mastering them. In any case, I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, so I'm going to go through a couple of these, but we have some excellent quotes on the sense of time, and in particular on boredom, habit, phenomenology of settling in. Let's end on one of these. Ultimately, there is something odd about settling in somewhere new, about the perhaps laborious process of getting used to new surroundings and fitting in. A task we undertake almost for its own sake, with the definite intention of abandoning the place again as soon as it's accomplished, or shortly thereafter. Returning to our previous state, we insert that sort of thing into the mainstream of our lives as a king of interruption or interlude, for the purpose of recreation, which is to say, refreshing, revitalizing exercise of the organism, because it was in immediate danger of overindulging itself in the uninterrupted monotony of daily life. This is suggesting why people go on vacations, to change things up, as it were, of languishing and growing in depth. And have a little more time. Let's talk about boredom. Boredom, what people call boredom, perhaps this accords with your own feeling, is actually an abnormal compression of time caused by monotony of the same thing happening over and over again, like a chessboard made of only brown squares. It's monotonous, not patterned. Uninterrupted uniformity can shrink large spaces of time until the heart falters, terrified to death. You might think about how somebody who is, say, old, it's like, where did the last 50 years go? Well, did you live every day in a similar fashion so that you compress time in an odd way so that 50 years felt very short over time? Something you may know as athletes, if you go for a run, the first time you go for a run, it feels much longer than the second time you go the same path. This is why often when people are racers, they are told to run the race path so they have a conceptualization of the race and know where to go fast and slow. And it also, the race feels easy the second time you run the course rather than the first. And so there are actual practical principles that come from this notion. In any case, when one day is like every other, then all days are like one. And perfect homogeneity would make the longest life seem very short, as if it had flown by in a twinkling. One wonders. Though so many interesting things happened during the course of Ulysses, whether that text was meant to showcase in one day, every day, of Stephen Dedalus and Leopold Bloom's lives. Is there a way in which a single day can be an accurate symbolic representation of the entirety of a life, given the pattern of one's existence? That said, let's end with habit. Habit arises when our sense of time falls asleep, or at least grows dull. And if the years of youth are experienced slowly, while the later years of life hurtle past at an ever-increasing speed, it must be habit that causes it. We know full well that the insertion of new habits or the changing of old ones is the only way to preserve life. It's perhaps why individuals in middle and older age acquire new habits or get into new sports or arts. They might think, well, how good are you going to get at something if you start at 50? Well, maybe the question is, how good will your life be if you change things up? To renew our sense of time, to rejuvenate, intensify, and retard our experience of time and slow it down, and thereby renew our sense of life itself. That is the reason for every change of scenery and air, a trip to the shore, experience of a variety of refreshing episodes. So I leave you today hoping that you will yourselves pursue many varieties of